2020 was a problematic year for all of us, not just because of COVID, but the myriad flow-on effects and challenges that stemmed from it. And while the pandemic is far from over, it's worth reflecting on what has happened thus far and what we can learn from it to improve and strengthen our supply chains. And so it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Siarl Dixon and Tatiana Rodriguez from AIB International. Siarl is the Certification Manager at AIB International, responsible for all BRC global standards schemes such as food safety, packaging, storage and distribution, agents and brokers, plant-based and ethical trade and responsible sourcing. Siarl is also a BRCGS approved training provider with 20 years experience in the industry and has conducted hundreds of ethical sourcing audits under Sedex's SMETA and other banners. Tatiana joined AIB International in 2016, and after various roles through multiple departments, she is now the Regional Sales Manager, East Coast, Canada and Global Sales. Tatiana is the primary point of contact for the Pandemic Preparedness certification, which is the first certification standard created for the food and beverage supply chain to address the pandemic. Siarl and Tatiana, over to you, and thank you for joining us today. And now I will just pass control over. Over to you, Siarl.
Lovely, thank you very much. That seems to have worked well. So thank you for that introduction. And my name is Siviyer Dixon. I look after a few things here at AIB, but in a previous life, I used to do a lot of social accountability audits under SMETA and the banners. So joining me is Tatiana, and Tatiana's kindly enough agreed to help with the questions at the end. By that point, I'm sure you'll be fed up of hearing my voice. So the title is Crisis and Pandemic Preparedness for Supply Chains. So what we're going to look at is how this pandemic prepared certification assists you with your ETI base code commitments. The two work together very well. I hope to demonstrate that in the next half an hour or so. First, a little bit about AIB. So our mission is to positively impact the food supply chain. What we're trying to do is promote food integrity, equip our clients with knowledge, and support the delivery of safe, high-quality food every day. Now, we're not new. We've been around more than 100 years now, and we've been providing technical expertise in that time, and we service over 126 countries. We're recognized globally by top companies for our consolidated standards, which are focused on food safety, and we inspire the entire food industry to embrace and apply the highest food integrity standards. As a service provider to only the food industry, we saw so much information in so many places and decided to collate this information for the industry. Our thought was to provide a service in the way of a checklist. The more we looked, the more we found. So then we collected plans and information via interviews with multinational companies and small companies as well, and realized there was so much information that could be best contained in a standard accessible to the industry and something that was auditable. So just to set the stage on what we've been dealing with, as a result of the pandemic, the entire food and beverage supply chain is now operating very differently than it did some 12 months ago. Now, this impact is different from place to place. It might be relatively limited where you are, but it is radical somewhere else. So the pandemic brought these immense shifts. As more consumers were eating at home, some manufacturers increased production to between 120 to 130% of what they were doing before, just to meet the demand. We've seen disruptions up and down the supply chain with ingredient shortages, supplier approval issues, and some mandated shutdowns. For some, pretty much everyone I know, staffing has been an issue, either just to help meet demand or, unfortunately, due to infections in the workforce. In response, processors like meat packers have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on safety equipment, such as personal protective gear, thermal scanners, and workplace partitions, and they boosted workers' pay to encourage them to stay on the job. To accommodate these many changes, manufacturers and others stepped up to innovate and sometimes simply maintain operations. As they say, necessity is the mother of invention. And we saw that as the supply chain adapted to the pandemic, new products were developed, employee safety was prioritized, manufacturers capitalized on new trends, and consumers eating more at home. But now, as we look further into 2021 and look towards returning to some sort of normalcy, I'd insist that instead of going back to what was and what brought us this disruption, that we drop that notion and start thinking about what could be. Instead of returning to what was, the food and beverage supply chain needs to continue moving forward. But how do we do that? Before answering the how question, we want to address the why. So aside from the ever-present need to maintain business continuity, you may be wondering, with the vaccines now here and on their way, isn't the pandemic almost over? While we can see light at the end of the current tunnel, we know that pathogens can and will continue to emerge from nature. We're already seeing variants of COVID-19 spring up from very different places around the globe. These are going to impact the supply chain's ability to operate. We've seen it before with H1N1, better known as swine flu, a decade ago. Then there was Ebola in West Africa, Zika virus in South and Central America over the past 5 years, and now the current coronavirus, which continues to evolve and develop. Today, we have a greater understanding of a pandemic crisis because of what we've learned this year. We were very lucky not to have to suffer this for over 100 years in most countries. But we cannot just wait for this pandemic event to conclude and then forget those lessons. We need to plan for the next one, which may even be transmissible through food. To be prepared for that next event, it's critical that you develop and implement a plan that prioritizes mitigating the impacts of pandemic in all facets of your operation. So what we're going to do is look at those 5 key lessons and how you can apply that and be prepared. The 5 key lessons from 2020. That was a year of learning, lots of learning. We've distilled it down to these 5 key areas that I think have been most critical for us and our customers. Assess and mitigate your risks. Manage your supply chain. Align and manage your resources. Administer health protocols. Assess practices and procedures. Through the application of these lessons as we continue to move through this pandemic and beyond, you can effectively decrease the risks to your brand, employees, and customers now and well into the future. So we're going to look at each of these 5 in some more detail. By working closely with our clients, we synthesize these key lessons into our new pandemic prepared certification. My colleague translated these 5 key lessons into 5 key sections. These are pandemic crisis management, supply chain program management, intermittent operations planning, health mitigation measures and management, and finally, prerequisite program review. This is the first and only certification standard created for the food and beverage supply chain that elevates critical planning for people, facilities, and production inputs and can deliver significant social impacts, builds bottom line resiliency, and can unlock insurance benefits. This proactive measure will help companies across the food and beverage supply chain prepare for the future with a best-in-class protocol benchmark. When I reviewed the requirements in the Pandemic Prepared Standard, which is laid out like a self-help guide, I was struck by how it could help with compliance to the ETI base code and assist greatly with SMETA audits. There has been a clear intersection between the challenges presented by COVID-19 and ethical trade issues. Managers at a meat plant were taking bets on how many of the workers would contract COVID. A migrant worker in Canada was fired for complaining about the lack of social distancing. Migrant workers cannot find new employers in Canada. Canadian police, in another case, have opened a corporate manslaughter investigation related to a COVID death, and workers at a factory in the UK said the safety measures were insufficient and it went to the press. These stories are from simply the USA, Canada, and the UK. No doubt you have seen similar headlines. Pandemic prepared certification is, I think, your guide to tackling these urgent challenges. So, the first lesson: to effectively assess and mitigate risks associated with events like a pandemic that may negatively impact facility operations, people, and a company brand reputation, a crisis plan is necessary. You should ready responses and assign responsibilities for your operation to be prepared to effectively deal with the crisis as it unfolds and restore operations once that crisis passes. So we're going to go through each of the major chapters in this, and as we go through, we'll demonstrate how it aligns with SMETA audits as well. You've likely all been involved in a crisis of some sort at some time in your career, but it was probably related to a recall or maybe a natural disaster of some kind. Those were issues that you'd identified as the most likely threats to your operation. Very few in the food and beverage supply chain considered pandemic as a likely threat, which left many of us unprepared. That's why it's important to address managing supply chain and operational needs during a pandemic-related crisis. Facilities need to be confident that operations will continue without disruption and that plans are in place to work around any problems created by the evolving situation. You will need to plan for how your facility continues to manufacture wholesome and safe products while implementing measures to protect the workforce. That plan can start with a risk assessment like you would for HACCP, but instead of focusing solely on food safety, focus should shift and identify what could be impacted by the pandemic. For every likely impact, identify the action items needed to mitigate that impact, and then you have to test it. Put it through its paces, make sure it works, and your team understands how to use it. The management commitment for health and safety described in the ETI base code is mirrored in the pandemic prepared requirements. Pandemic prepared at the top, ETI base code at the bottom. The next section that we talk about is the management of the supply chain during a crisis. And this is essential to make sure that materials for manufacturing and employee protection as required are provided and maintained at acceptable levels in anticipation of a crisis management situation. Just as consumers were hoarding toilet paper and grocery store shelves were becoming bare, so too were stocks of materials critical to producing foods. How do you address that? Your operation will need to assign responsibilities for maintaining needed supplies to keep the facility operating. Raw materials, packaging, chemicals, personal protective equipment, and contracted services all need to be sourced and procured. Your operation will need to ensure access to necessary supplies and approve and procure supplies from existing and new vendors to prevent a shutdown due to a supply chain disruption. It's important that you're putting PPE or chemicals through your supplier approval process, while ensuring the chemicals that you're using to clean and sanitize for COVID are actually properly labeled and capable of cleaning. The ETI principle for providing a safe environment is replicated in the pandemic prepared certification. They mirror each other. Third, you have to have alignment between sales, operations, procurement, and human resources to ensure effective management of resources, including materials, workforce, and downtime availability. How do you plan on running during a crisis, shutting down the facility, and starting up after the planned shutdown? You'll need a process and best practices for protecting the workforce during the crisis, preparing the equipment, and building for a planned shutdown of operations, and workforce, building and equipment preparation needed prior to startup of operations. If you're running during the crisis, it's critical that even during extended production runs, adequate downtime has to be scheduled so that the required maintenance and sanitation activities can still be completed. If you're shutting down, You'll need to think through everything from how you will handle raw materials to communicating with your employees about what to expect, and then actually initiating a shutdown of the facility. And then, post-crisis, startup planning and bring the facility back online to resume operations. While leadership and employee communication continues to be important during this stage, so is planning for your startup sequence, conducting documented site inspection to make sure it's ready for production. The ETI principle for providing wages, decent hours, and regular work is addressed in the intermittent operations planning section. Fourth, the assessment of national and local health department protocols and implementation, as appropriate, must be considered, tailored to the facility, and administered to effectively prevent transmission of respiratory viral disease between members of the workforce. Assess your mitigation measures that must be taken to prevent disease transmission between all workers, visitors, and contract service providers in the facility. Management of people practices, PPE, social distancing, and training are all critical to protecting the health of persons inside the facility. The health crisis mitigation measures and management standards provide the best practices for optimizing and maintaining workforce health throughout the crisis. This should also include how PPE in your facility is discarded as rubbish or garbage. Do you treat it as contaminated and dispose of it in a dedicated bin? How about employees taking home reusable masks? To do so is to lose control over those items and what they're exposed to. Have you reviewed donning and doffing procedures with any additional PPE that your workforce may be wearing? Do you have visuals of the proper procedure? Do you monitor the donning and doffing of PPE? There is a lot more to think about here, and it goes far beyond temperature screening, which is what we're seeing a lot of happening, just temperature screening and that's it. So, Section 4 of the Pandemic Prepared Certification addresses a number of ETI base code principles. So much so that I couldn't get them all onto one slide. It covers a whole panoply of things that are covered in the ETI base code, which are covered in SMETA audits. With all of that understanding, you may be thinking, well, we're a big manufacturer, we're all buttoned up, it's all fine. Unfortunately, that is simply not the case. When we did our research, we reviewed the preparedness plans of some of the top food and beverage companies in the world. They are our clients. And we found that 75% of them miss critical requirements. 75% had also failed health crisis mitigation requirements. So even if you think you're confident, review your plans again. So what are they missing? Let's get into some of the most common pitfalls of pandemic preparedness that we saw when we were reviewing some of these major companies' plans. These are some top tips that we're giving you for free. Improper PPE disposal. When your team removes their PPE at the end of their shift, think about where it goes. Does it go in the most convenient waste receptacle? If it's something like a reusable mask, maybe it has the logo of their favorite sport team on it, and it's kept for personal use, does it go in their pocket and then go home? If you're unsure or if it's going off-site, then you're losing control of that equipment and a critical step to virus mitigation. Instead, commit to having clearly marked containers for disposable single-use PPE, like gloves, face masks, and hairnets. Furthermore, your site should have provided clearly marked containers for any reusable PPE designated for washing or sanitizing, like goggles, face shields, non-disposable gowns, and so on. Hand washing. Now, that might seem simple, but quite honestly, have you trained your team on how and when to wash their hands? Hand washing and or hand sanitizing needs to be done prior to handling and donning PPE. And hand washing or hand sanitizing after doffing PPE should also be required. Have you provided them the resources to do so? Hand wash stations should be provided with touch-free taps, soap, and single-use paper towel dispensers. Are these stations accessible for all areas of the facility? Now think about this. Production, packaging, maintenance, shipping, receiving, your sanitation areas, and your PPE donning and doffing areas. You might have to put in additional installations to meet the new need. Since the pandemic started, you may have provided your team with new PPE. Have they been trained on how to use it? Now that training could include instruction to minimize habits such as retying a gown or adjusting your face mask or other contact with their PPE. Do they understand when disposable masks should be replaced when they become soiled or damp and then not reused? Training should also include how to properly remove face masks to prevent cross-contamination. And there should be signage that's very visible to reinforce this training. Do you have established protocols for contact tracing after a COVID-19 positive case is identified? This could include all individuals who are in contact with that person. The area where contamination risks have been identified should then be quarantined and no employee is permitted to enter, except for the trained and designated cleaning staff. What's your plan then for cleaning those areas and releasing them from quarantine? The responsibility for release of a quarantined area after cleaning should be assigned to individuals or a department. Documented verification activities that include environmental sampling and the requirement for negative results or validation of cleaning methodology should have been established and implemented in advance. You should have separate areas for PPE, donning and doffing to help limit exposure between shifts. Do you have written donning and doffing sequence procedures in your facilities? Are your employees required to follow them? Your facility should have signage depicting these procedures for donning and doffing. They should be in the appropriate languages and posted in dressing rooms or the designated area for this activity. Do you have procedures for cleaning contaminated areas? Do you have the PPE required for use by an internal cleanup crew assigned to clean those areas? You're likely dealing with different chemicals than normally used, so you'll want to make sure you're prepared. So who then is responsible for the cleanup procedure administration, seeing that it's done correctly and documenting its completion? For instance, the use of compressed air or high pressure water or steam, all very common. But should they be used because there's an additional risk of generating an aerosol? You need to think of all these things in advance. You might want to consider hiring specialized contractors for the cleanup of potentially contaminated areas. There are some advantages to this. For example, the contractor will supply trained personnel, all the PPE, and all the proper chemicals needed to complete the cleaning. This is the only certification of its kind, providing a number of unique benefits. First, it's specific to the food and beverage supply chain. It's been developed to address the unique challenges we face in this industry. Secondly, it's practical, vetted, and auditable. It's very prescriptive in its nature. Third, it provides assurance for employees, insurance providers, retailers, and consumers that a company is committed to establishing and maintaining the best practices. Fourthly, insurability and risk mitigation. It can be used to prove that your company is lowering their business's risk of being negatively impacted by any future pandemics or an offspring of the current pandemic, and can lower the legal risk and insurance premiums. This provides the food and beverage supply chain with a single source reference as a comprehensive resource and associated certification based on good manufacturing practices, common regulatory requirements, and food safety practices. You'll note there are 5 distinct categories in the Pandemic Prepared Certification Standard, each of which addresses a unique aspect of a food and beverage facility. You'll see that these align with our 5 key lessons from the year, and that's because we've learned and we've now put it into practice. Operators will need to demonstrate proficiency in each of these 5 areas to become certified to this standard. We've recently announced our first 2 certifications have been achieved. So, Saudi Arabia-based Al Marai Company, a leading food and beverage company and the world's largest vertically integrated dairy operation, became the first company in the world to achieve pandemic prepared certification. Now, if you're familiar with Al Marai, they're such a leading and influential brand. For them to be first to become certified and pandemic prepared speaks to both the quality of the standard and Al Marai's ongoing commitment to their employees, customers, and consumers. And then recently, Industrial Packaging passed their certification. They're a leading customized contract packaging technical services provider and packaging materials and machinery supplier for food and beverage manufacturers. Some of you may well use their products. They are the first packaging company in the world and the first US-based company to achieve pandemic prepared certification. So we have already provided certification in both the Middle East and in North America. And there are many more who have signed on to become certified in the near future. We hope that you join them soon. There are numerous ways that you can begin that process, all of which are available on our website. First is our free preparedness review. This free Get Started email series introduces you to the 5 critical components on pandemic preparedness. In a new checklist each week, we'll present foundational questions that you can use to review your plans and protocols. Second is a complimentary preparedness plan review. Pandemic prepared certification pre-assessment. This pre-assessment is an essential step that identifies gaps between your preparedness program and the rigorous certification standard, providing detailed opportunities for improvement, so you can resolve non-conformances before the certification audit. It is offered virtually or on site. We're doing everything through Zoom these days, it seems. Pandemic Prepared Certification Standard Introduction, Interpretation and Implementation course. Now, this is an on-demand online course and consulting package. It'll introduce you to the requirements of the Pandemic Prepared Certification Standard so you can establish and maintain best practices for COVID-19 and beyond. You and your team can complete the course at your pace, then schedule a free video conference consulting session with our team to get answers to your questions. You can also purchase the standard on its own, which covers the key requirements of the certification and begin putting the measures in place that you'll need to successfully pass the certification audit. Pandemic Prepared Certification is available internationally, and we're already working with global food and beverage brands to proactively prepare them for the future with both virtual and on-site audits. If you want to learn more, please contact Inga. Her details are on the screen, or the general contact for this program is ppc@aibinternational.com. Thank you very much for your attention. Now I think it's time for some questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Siarl. I'll kick off with a question. Obviously, there's vaccines that are being manufactured almost everywhere now. Isn't that going to reduce the overall need or the risk and make some of these procedures redundant?
I'll take that one. I hope we're all crossing our fingers for this, but just yesterday in the UK, the government's chief scientist said that there were concerns that this would become a winter event for years to come. We have already started seeing variants out there. Most of the vaccines have good reaction rates. They have offer good protection against those variants. But my background is in microbiology and biotechnology, and me and my cohort, we kind of like, it's 100 years since the last pandemic. How did we manage that? Because of our understanding of how these things evolve out there in nature and how they evolve within us as a human species. So yes, whilst we may be dodging this bullet, we don't know where the next one is coming from. the industry wasn't prepared for this one. Let's be prepared for the next one. Okay. Tatiana, did you want to add anything to that?
No, you're absolutely right. Studies show that I believe it's every 8 months now that a new disease is coming out that's transmitted through humans. So we definitely want to make sure that we're not as ill prepared for the next one as we were for this one.
So you mentioned that 75% of some of these big globals who'd gone through the process failed. So how much work is actually involved in getting there, if you like, and how long does it take? What kind of resourcing, or what should people expect to have to do in order to get there?
I can take this one. So it varies. It's not a gotcha audit. It's also not an easy audit or certification to pass, but we offer all the tools to prepare a company to obtain that certification. So Siarl mentioned all of the options that we have, everything from, I believe one of the best options is our free preparedness plan review. That's when we have a conversation. It's anywhere from 30 to 45 minutes. We do have some leading questions, but it gives us a good gauge to see what programs do you have in place? What are you missing? And then we know from there. So do you need some virtual online training? Can you jump straight into a certification? Can you do a pre-assessment? But we do have tools in place to figure out exactly where you are in the process so that you do obtain certification should you want it.
Great. So that's for you. What about your suppliers? Does this help them, or, obviously, let's say you've got a multinational that has significant resources and capacity. What if you're dealing with smaller enterprises further down the chain that might be SMEs that have less capacity? So how can you involve them in the process?
Sure, I'll take this one too. All right. So with that, I think this goes, it just ties into food safety, the supply chain. You want to make sure that even your suppliers are also implementing and managing their operations best practices, because it's also going to improve your operation. So if you obtain certification and then your suppliers have certification, you're going to feel a little bit more at ease if they do have this, best in class protocol benchmark, because then you'll know, okay, they went through the certification, so they have a plan and a team in place to make sure that they can deliver.
Great. And in terms of interactions between this as a standard, are there any, government-driven standards or any other international standards out there, not SMETA, that intersect or cover this kind of area? Or is this pretty much unique?
So the certification is unique. Again, it is so the certification came to be because our clients were reaching our clients and people that weren't our clients, because they were getting so much information. It was an overload of information from all sorts of places, regulatory, from scheme owners, just all over. So we did come up with the instead of a checklist, which they're out there as well, we came up with the standard, but we did look at different thought leadership. We did look at regulatory information, and we did make sure that everything we created was vetted through them as well. But it is a standalone. There's only one of these.
Interesting. And I'm not a microbiologist like you, Siarl, but you mentioned earlier that there's a preference for single-use paper towels over air drying. What's the rationale, if I can ask?
Yeah, aerosols are bad. It's as simple as that. So in normal times, hot air dryers are perfectly satisfactory. But at the moment, this is an aerosol-driven contamination. So anything that creates an aerosol is immediately seen as bad news and avoidable. Now, if there are other issues of the hot air towel is the best that you can do, yada yada yada, there are reasons for it. All this is to do is about minimizing risk. We can't get rid of risk completely. Okay, so if you have a choice, exercise that choice. The main concern, actually, I don't want people to focus on hot air dryers. Actually, the main concern that I've had, so I've been auditing right through this. And even though I don't sound it, I live in Canada. And I've been auditing right through this. And most of the places that I've gone to, I have raised issues to do with things like social distancing, hand washing, personal protective equipment, and so on. Most of the places I've gone to. I've had 2 visits in the last 3 weeks, either cancelled or delayed because of reported COVID cases on sites. So whilst in some parts of the world this isn't such an immediate issue, it's very real and present elsewhere. And the overriding concern is that as an industry, we have not been operating to anything like a gold standard. So I don't want to have a conversation more about hot air dryers. I'd rather have a conversation about access to liquid soap and warm water. Yeah. And the disciplines that go around that. Do you need, my local supermarket has installed warm water, touchless hand wash basins at the entrance to the supermarket. I go to that supermarket because they have soap and water rather than the gel. Now the gel's fine, but we know soap and water works. So it's just to do with a sliding scale of preference. Do you follow? So yes, aerosols, bad, but if they're unavoidable, fine. We'll have to live with them, I suppose. But if you can, put in disposable towels. If you can, increase the access to soap and water. That's what this is all about. It's understanding that sliding scale slope of desirability, going from the status quo, which frankly in most cases isn't actually good enough, through to being the gold standard, protecting ourselves, protecting each other, protecting our workplace, protecting our consumers and our families.
Okay, so I guess you could say similar to SMETA, for instance, it tells you, what is acceptable and what are good practices, if you like. So there are a variety of different options, and it's about trying to encourage iterative improvements.
That's right.
So
it's very much written as a how-to guide, actually.
Okay.
Yeah,
so
I didn't write it. I can't say credit for that.
So the expectation is that somebody would want to be recertified, annually, every 2, every 3 years? What cycle are you envisaging?
So with this, you have use of the mark. It is 1 year from the day that you obtain your certificate and your report, your final report. But it's completely up to you. So at this point, we don't have it like with traditional certifications where you have a window in which you recertify. It is something that a client should discuss either within themselves or with suppliers, insurance. It is up to them as to when they want to recertify, but they can only use the mark for 1 year from the day of certification.
Now, you mentioned 2 organizations have gone through, one in dairy, one in specialist packaging. Are you seeing any trends in terms of the specific areas or subsectors where there is particular interest or need for this kind of certification?
We've actually had more certify. Those are 2 that we're just comfortable with having a public announcement.
Yep.
But we've had manufacturing, we've had plastic. So these are the ones that have passed. There are other ones that have not been able to obtain certification as of yet. But there isn't one particular sector at this point.
Okay. Are you noticing any particular trends in terms of geography? Is this more of a North American and European thing, or are you seeing this globally?
Globally, it's definitely global.
Okay. And in terms of the documentation itself, it's available not just in English, it's available in multiple languages, or just
So
English?
it is. No, it's available in English and Spanish, but we also do have, we have many auditors all around the world. We have translations available. So the resources are there if need be to conduct in another language.
Okay. Now, those are the questions that we've got from the audience thus far. Ladies and gentlemen, do you have any further or follow-up questions that you'd like it to ask? If so, please post them through the question box within GoToWebinar, and I will pose them for you now. That being said, if you would prefer, you can also leave your details at the end of the event. There will be a survey, and you can put your details in there, and Siarl and Tatiana would be very happy to follow up with you directly. Okay, if there's no further questions, then I will thank you both very much for your time. And I know it's late where you are. Thank you for joining us from North America. And thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening, and have yourselves a fantastic day. What's left of it.
Lovely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.